Good morning. Welcome to the second session. My name is, you can see it says Peter Lannon. I'm a pharmacist by profession and have worked in the pharmaceutical industry for approximately 20 years, with the last 17 or most of it in pharmacovigilance. I am the director of a very small consulting company, being myself, and I'd just like to take this opportunity and first of all thank the organising committee and everyone for their generosity and help in asking me to speak at this conference. I will do my best to try and keep it practical. This is what the approach to my presentation will be. In a nutshell, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the risk management plan and the first marketing authorization application in the EU and a practical approach. A lot of this has come to the fore in the recent months. It's a very recent example, so I'm hoping to be able to give you some indication of what it is that we went through in doing this. The experience that I have is with the current client I'm working for. A lot of this information is anonymized for very good reason. Submission has just been submitted, so we are still in the very, very early stages of this. But I do think it ties in quite nicely with the accelerated development programs which Greg alluded to earlier, and just to give you an indication of where we are in the process and how this has come about. So basically, just to give you a little background of the situation, there is essentially a new marketing authorization application for a late-stage oncology product. The drug has orphan drug designation in the EU, which means that it has an incidence of less than 5 in 10,000 patients. So it is classified as very niche market, very specific, and as a result of it, it has a less detailed registration process and is not required to submit as much data as a application for which a drug does not have orphan drug status. Basically, this is the indication is in combination therapy. Combination chemotherapy followed by maintenance monotherapy. The drug is a VEGF inhibitor, so vascular endothelial growth factor receptor inhibitor. And the company clinical program was stopped in 2011, not for any safety reasons, but because basically it showed no substantial efficacy in the indications that it was studied, which were non-small cell lung cancer, glioblastoma, and colorectal cancer. Subsequent to this, an investigator-sponsored study by the MRC, Medicines Research Council in the UK, published data which showed new efficacy, but the efficacy was in ovarian cancer. So, as a result, which is you can clearly see there's a massive difference between what the company has in its safety database in colorectal non-small cell lung cancer versus efficacy in oncology. There was no clinical development program for oncology. However, this is an unmet medical need, so it was a very small niche market, and the company were very pleased about this. And basically, the endpoints were primary progression-free survival, which showed a very small increase, albeit an increase in progression-free survival, average being about 2.3, 2.5 months, but with a limited overall survival. Overall survival showed a numerical improvement, however, it wasn't statistically significant. So currently the indication is, the basis of this submission is on progression-free survival. Now, this wasn't just an out of the blue, or was sort of a happenstance finding that the company came across. It was an investigator-sponsored study. However, it didn't just spark off a whole bunch of submission activity. There was a lot of discussion and discussion sharing with EMA in terms of what the clinical data looked like, what the submission would entail, and what the particular study was that was going to be used. So, in a nutshell, the basis of this submission is a single pivotal study, but not a company-sponsored study, an investigator-sponsored study. So not only have we gone with one single clinical study, it's one which the company didn't design. And I will get to some of the details behind it. So The decision was made basically to do this using a single pivotal study. The company has also used other studies in its development program to characterize and identify the safety component of this. And there was a big scientific pre-discussion with the EMA about what the study entailed and how we would go about doing that. So from a project-related challenges, I'm going to try and talk you through some of the more practical aspects of it. I won't get into any of the science at this stage. Basically, the company, there was no real, the design was kind of outside of the control of the company. And for examples of this is that the data was collected per the investigator protocol, not necessarily in the way and manner in which the company was used to accumulating data. However, it's a renowned research institute in the UK with some very prominent investigators and research scientists. So some ideas or examples of what we didn't have, for example, time to onset was recorded as the next clinic visit. The next clinical, so an adverse event time to onset was recorded as the next clinical visit. So visits were 3 weeks apart. So as you can see, there was a possibility that we wouldn't really get a good or accurate time to onset. However, for SAEs, onset date was captured absolutely on the date. So when you're looking at the terms of SAE relationships to, and investigating those and analyzing that, it's absolutely fine. But in the bigger scheme of things, in the context of the majority of adverse events, they were, the time to onset was not so great. Another example where data wasn't collected was that the outcome for non-serious adverse events wasn't collected. So these are all difficulties which we had in analysing the data. As I reiterate once again that it was the EMA who suggested that we come with an application on the strength of this data. So it wasn't something that was just high fly. There was some negotiation and discussion, but we were kind of struggling because of this is something that sort of came out of the blue. The company program was stopped. There was no resource for this, and as we've alluded to earlier, safety sometimes comes as the last port of call, and people don't always figure that it needs as bigger input as it does. So we had a very limited resource. First of all, we had competition within the organisation with another high-profile, fast-track submission going through the FDA for a very particular mutated status in non-small cell lung cancer. So not only did we have constraints within our patient safety or pharmacovigilance remit, we also were competing with other projects in the company for senior stakeholder review. And when you understand the level of detail and the amount of data that we had to analyze in this particular instance, it shows you where, how much of an impact that would be. There was also conflicting priorities. There was only one full-time employee, the equivalent of one full-time employee in the safety department, that being me. I'm not employed by the company. I'm employed as a consultant. So a lot of the work that was originally scheduled couldn't be done internally, and it resulted in the outsourcing of particular parts of the safety aspects. For example, the outsourcing of the RMP was done to a CRO initially, and that had its own complexities and how it was managed. So there we go. Moving on, there was a lot of discussion backwards and forwards about whether or not the submission was going to go ahead. Basically, the company hadn't made a firm decision as to what they would do yet, and it was sort of really at the last minute that we submit. The decision to submit was made, which does cause difficulties in terms of can lead to staff motivation problems, because sometimes people would think, well, we've been asked to deliver this on a very short timeline. So how on earth do we go about doing this, given that we don't know if it's going to be submitted? And also management would be sort of trying to relocate resource, however minimal it was, to other projects because they weren't quite kept in the loop. But anyway, so resource was limited, and there was also a considerable lack of company foresight and planning. This being a new submission, it was being submitted as a centrally authorized procedure, which as you know, entails the production of a risk management plan, which is significantly different to, well, not significantly, but there is a new format in which the RMP needs to be written based on the 2012 GVP guidance. And the complexity of producing the RMP, I think, was underestimated by the clinical team. And as a result of it, a whole bunch of things kind of got messed around. And I put here timing of sequence of hire document, draft, review, and approval. An example of this is the interaction between the RMP and particular modules in the submission or in the ECTD, being the summary of clinical safety, the clinical overview, the non-clinical overview. It all ties together. The RMP is essentially, it brings the entire submission together with a little bit of efficacy and all of the safety, highlighting the important and identified potential risks considered for the drug. So there was a lot of many different aspects which had to be managed. For example, with the timing and sequence. When I initially saw the project plan, there was the approval of the RMP before the final label had been agreed, which is a little bit back to front, considering that your RMP needs to reference risk minimization measures, which the SMPC is one of the key minimization measures, albeit routine. An additional fact to this was that there is a huge volume of data to analyze. And also constantly changing timelines, because we had another drug which was going through development or going through submission at the same time, so we constantly had to change our timelines to allow for senior management review, and that one got priority over us. So it was constantly changing, and we had to be flexible and adapt. So that's really on the project-related approach. So the safety-related challenge. Establishing the safety profile and presentation of safety data was complex. We had over 5,800 patients worth of data to analyze, which is considerably different to what you would normally have in a first oncology submission. You would typically have probably 200, 250 patients at most. So we had massive data encompassing both a clinical development program within the company and investigator-sponsored studies, a large number of them. So the question was, how do we go about presenting this data, given that the indication which we're seeking isn't the indication for which the company has a development program? So it took a lot of thought in terms of how we would present the data. In other words, for a different indication. There was also lack of planning and foresight. Again, lack of inexperience in the producing of an RMP and what needed to go into it and how it was dependent on other documents. And because it was an investigator-sponsored study, as we got to terms of the data, we had to sometimes change the way in which it was analysed. There were no major problems and huge issues, but we had to deal with certain data we were lacking and certain things we couldn't actually present. And I'll get to you later as to how we overcame those and what we did. And there was, changing priorities and shifting goalposts, which are always difficult to manage. The next biggest problem, which is basically the crux of the RMP, is trying to establish your identified and potential risks. So, how do we go about doing this? Is it based on the investigator-sponsored study in the ovarian population, or is it based on the clinical program in various other solid tumours? Given that the population could be considerably different. Ovarian cancer, you're looking at an elderly patient population, female only. Generally, onset of ovarian cancers between the ages of 53 to 56. So we're looking at in general terms, a very, very distinct section of the population, where, as other indications, colorectal cancer and non-small cell lung cancer, it ranges across the board. So we had very distinct, sort of different population profile. So how did we do that? Basically, we had to look across the class to see what was there. This is not a first-in-class drug. It is a specific indication, but VEGF inhibitors have been around for a number of years. Some big examples of those are bevacizumab and pazopanib, which are used for various cancers. We had two particular toxicities, non-life-threatening toxicities, but potentially very debilitating in terms of quality of life. And I'll get onto those a little bit later. And the question was to how do we, and because of those toxicities, we had patients who were discontinuing use of the drug. And as you can see, what I said earlier, we have not a huge benefit in terms of progression-free survival. It is a small benefit, but they are added on benefits, and it didn't just only occur in one of the arms; it occurred in both of the active arms. It was a really complicated pooling of data in which how we did it, but it does seem to have benefit over and above the time period in which the patient is actually taking the drug. And as a result of it, there were a lot of dose modifications, reductions, pauses, not necessarily just to the chemotherapy, but also with the suspect drug itself, which, if you haven't got a lot of benefit to play with, you really can't afford many risks. The risk profile is very similar across the board. It's very similar to what the other VEGF inhibitors on the market have. We are not particularly better than any of them. We're not particularly worse. However, there are a couple which I will get to later. So, overcoming the project challenges. We needed to, first of all, bring the data in-house from the MRC, and we needed to validate the data, which took quite a long time. Which took quite a long time to do. And as we uncovered the data, we started to find there were certain areas which, because the statisticians and the scientists were working with the data, it wasn't in the format in which they would normally get from a sponsored study by the MAH. It was, although robust and scientifically accurate, it was prepared or formatted in a different way. So it had to be brought in-house, had to be validated, which took some time. There was also, we needed to understand the data to make sure that it was reasonable and scientifically credible. And we also needed to look at how the data was captured and basically identify gaps in the data that was there, which we could possibly draw on later in the submission, and how we would address those moving forward. But all of these were discussed very early on with the EMA, so that they were fully abreast of what the gaps in the data were. And as I say earlier, they were still very much in favour of the submission. Where it will go with at this point, I have no idea. When I say we are in the early stages of submission, we are talking as of 2 weeks ago. Submission was filed, and it has been accepted for review. So we've passed through validation, and the procedure has started. So we also had a problem with resources. I mean, resources are always an issue. There's never enough time, there's never enough people, especially on a product which essentially had died a couple of years before this all started to kick off. So we needed to work smartly. We needed to understand the data, we needed to be precise in our execution, and we needed to be very specific in what we needed. We didn't have time to reevaluate data. As it turned out, we often had to reevaluate data, and it became sort of laborious and really difficult. But at the end of the day, I think as a result of it, we've analysed the data, analysed the safety data to the nth degree. There is probably no stone left unturned in doing this. And although the pivotal study that's being part of that is the pivotal part of the submission has around about 500 odd patients, I think the entire safety data, but what we have is about 5,800 patients, which is considerably large. So we have a very, very good understanding of the safety data across a range of indications. So what else did we need to do? We had to utilise staff and consultants with previous MA submission and experience where it was available, and the company has done so. And we had to be careful. We had careful planning, as you'll see a lot of this thing, planning, and we had to be reactive to the changes that occurred. So that was quite difficult. The project timelines, we had to be adaptive and responsive again. Communication and education was absolutely paramount. especially for parts of the organisation who didn't fully understand and appreciate the role in which the RMP plays in the submission. It is essentially the final document that gets compiled because it pulls in from all other. It has very little new or de novo information in it. It pulls it from the clinical summary, it pulls it from the clinical overview, from the safety of clinical summary of clinical safety. So it's really a point in which data is pulled together. So to have certain documents being reviewed alongside it was quite difficult because it constantly meant that if one of the high-level documents like the summary of clinical safety was changed or updated, it knocked on the RMP, and to constantly manage that and keep abreast of it was quite difficult given that there were different authors. We had CROs working, the same CRO working on various, it was just quite difficult to manage. So a lot of it was a negotiation and education. There was also negotiation in terms of what is acceptable by high-level management in terms of where certain parts of the document will be completed, given that the SPC wasn't finished before the RMP was due to be approved. So we had to renegotiate that. And also what had to happen was that we had to have agreement from management that the standard procedure in which the company would follow in normal procedure would be that the RMP text will be finalised and approved. We had to have caveats in place that the RMP, certain text in the RMP, for example, input from the SPC where we'd have minimisation measures, those would be approved at approval stage, and they wouldn't actually necessarily be in a final review, given that the same group of people would be reviewing 3 different documents which all related to the RMP. And really it was to manage expectation of the team and stakeholders as to how long things took to do. I don't always think that they were kept, people that were working in some of the clinical teams, although they've got lots of experience in the clinical side of a submission, they weren't really up to speed of how much work needed to be put into an RMP. And so overcoming the high volume of safety data, we had this massive data to do. Yeah. And basically what we had to do is we had to find a creative and application and scientific principles. We had to look at presentation of the ISS data. We had a pool summarizing the ISS study with other MAH combination studies. So we pooled some data there. We then pooled the MAH monotherapy studies. And we looked across observations across the program from a safety perspective, bearing in mind that the indication was slightly different. And we also had to do an extensive literature review to try and understand some of the characteristics of the adverse events. One of the particular adverse events we have, which is of huge importance, is diarrhea. Across the class, there's about a percentage diarrhea in class of about 40. We're showing a percentage of about 93, which is particularly high. We don't understand, we don't know why. Preclinical work has not shown anything. And we're now looking at how this can happen. So, and what we're trying to do it. So we identified potential risks. Initially, they were based on the preclinical program and what we'd seen in other studies. We also looked at what was in the investigator-sponsored studies and across the MAH development program. And we finally looked at other class effects, identified potential risks, important identified risks and important potential risks. But we also had to take some caveats for those. For example, panzopanib has a particular toxicity to the liver, which we've not seen in any of our studies, and it seems to be that it's not a class effect, it's more of a molecule effect. So we had to make decisions based on clinical and scientific judgment. Another big thing came up because of these high rates of discontinuation. Do we include additional risk minimization measures or not, which is a requirement from the GVP guidelines, and not only as a requirement of the GVP guidelines, you now have to measure the efficacy of these risk minimization measures. So risk management to date will mostly be focused on investigator education and communication protocols and proposed SMPC. And this is a similar approach we will take in marketing at this point. As I say, I've always said this in the company that I'm consulting with at the moment, is that the RMP, this stage of the RMP, we're actually in, it's like proposal of marriage. You know, you're proposing to the EMA to get married to them with regards to this drug, but our RMP is really only a proposal. You know, the final vows will be said when we have an opinion as to what needs to happen, and it can change significantly between now and then. So we are preparing possible risk minimization measures. We're looking at, obviously there needs to be a benefit to the patient. It needs to be acceptable to the EMA. It also needs to be achievable. We've had situations within the company where additional risk minimization measures have been put in place, but they are not and are no longer, they're not achievable. They're not effective. So not only does it have to be achievable, it has to be cost effective. There is cost to the company. And most importantly, they have to be measurable. And measurable not only in two ways, a direct way and an indirect way. So a direct way in the reduction of the risk. So in this instance, the biggest one being diarrhea. Although they are not serious reports of diarrhea, they are usually CTC grade 1 and 2, but they are significant enough to cause concern for the patient. So we're working with patient advisory groups and some patient reference panels in the UK to try and understand the difficulties that patients with this type of event will have and how it impacts them. And really just some lessons learned. I would like to start off with these, and just to reiterate again, is that always follow the science. The science never lies. It doesn't. Early planning is essential when you have limited resource and aggressive timelines. Stay focused. Not knowing to submit or not to submit, you can get distracted. But if you stick to what it is that you're tasked at doing, it generally works better. Communication is essential in the team in terms of where you've got different authors contributing to the same sections of safety documents. Its manageability is almost a nightmare. So it's very important to stay in communication as well with stakeholder review and senior management to inform them of just how voluminous the data would be. One comment we received on the summary of clinical safety, for example, was that it's incredibly long, at which point it was pointed out that we do have 8,000, 5,000, almost 6,000 patients worth of data, as opposed to 200. So, and transparency. It's very important to be transparent, which the company was early on with the EMA, to show their limited resource, or show the limitations of the study and how it will be addressed. Creativity. It's often said that you can't be creative in R&D. I tell you what, creativity was definitely needed here, and you can be creative. Some people say it's impossible, but as Greg said earlier, we need to be able to try and think about how we present data in a different way. Be creative. We still need to make sure it's scientifically credible, and we can't use statements that are rash and out of the blue, but we need to follow the science. But you can be creative. We have to be flexible and reactive to any change that happen, because trust me, it happened on a day-to-day basis. And resourceful. You need to look at where the resource is, where the knowledge is, and use it to the best of your leverage. We're in the early stages of development, or of submission. We're expecting interim or provisional assessment report in October, and day 120 questions in November. So it's going to be a very busy Christmas period for all involved. But the company remains optimistic and hopeful, and we look forward to working in the future. But if you have any questions on this, I'm sure I've opened up a can of worms here. I didn't really expect when I went into the company that this would be the situation we were dealt. It's a rather unorthodox situation, but it's an example of how, because of increased pressures from external pressures in terms of therapies should be generated, can't we find a cure for cancer, can't we do this? It's very, very important. And just so that you know, the indication is late-stage platinum-resistant ovarian cancer. So we are talking about a very, very small percentage of population. But I thank you for your time, and I hope that I've been able to give something to you today. And I'm happy for you to ask me any questions that you have. I'll answer the best I can, or to what I'm permitted to. Yes, Alistair. Sorry? No, the client. Oh, sorry. Yes, they are. They are particularly focused. The difficulty we had was that this program had ended. So there was basically all the resource had been allocated to other projects, and at this sort of stage, it was, don't get me wrong, they are incredible. They're a big pharma company with a lot of new oncology indications, and if anyone looks at the press, you probably don't need to know who this is, but they're a massive new portfolio that are coming through submission at the moment. So it's safe to say that they are very focused on safety, but just in this particular drug, it had died. So they had to try and resurrect it. And, we were very fortunate, and one of the people in safety who was around, she has been around since day dot. So she has sort of 10 years experience in the development of the compound. So it was really useful to be able to have. Yes?
The question that I have is more from a legal perspective than from a PV perspective. Probably it is the first time that I hear that an investigator-initiated study is being announced for a marketing authorization application from a company who is not sponsoring the study.
Yeah.
So my question is, what kind of agreement was there between the company and the investigator to avoid the litigation?
Okay. I can't answer that exactly because, to coin a phrase, it's above my pay grade. I don't quite kind of know that's sort of above the level that I was working at. There is an agreement. I don't know to what level it is, but basically my understanding is the company purchased the data and rights from the data and rights of that study from the MRC. I don't know the level of detail exactly. Sorry, I can't answer your question. I do understand the question completely, but I'm sorry, I can't.
Because what I normally know is that an investigator-initiated study receives support from a pharmaceutical company, be it the drug, be it the database, be it money, be it whatever you want. So if another company was sponsoring that investigator-initiated study, how can a third company...
No, it's this company that was sponsoring that study.
Okay.
Yeah, this company was providing drug.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, is anybody else?
Thank you very much.